primary concern here in Colorado. All right, so what are invasive species? These are non-native plants, animals, or pathogens that have been introduced to a location where they have no predators. Once they have been introduced to this location, they have harmful effects on our natural resources and our use of those resources. These impacts can be economic, cultural, and ecological. Our program focuses almost entirely on aquatic invasive species, or what we more commonly refer to as A.N.S. So while there is a wide diversity of aquatic nuisance species that could impact Colorado's waters, these are the species that are considered prohibited per our Parks and Wildlife regulations. We're very fortunate that the majority of these species are not known to Colorado at this time, but if they were to become introduced, they have the potential to have devastating impacts on our aquatic ecology. So we just do everything we can to keep them out. There are a couple exceptions. We do currently have known populations of New Zealand mudsnails and rusty crayfish, and a couple of different aquatic invasive plants. So I'll talk just a little bit about a few of the primary species of concern. So first and foremost, zebra and quagga mussels. These are the most costly invasive species in the entire United States. They are a freshwater bivalve mollusk that has 3 characteristics that make them particularly detrimental if they become introduced. First, they have a rapid reproduction. One single mussel can produce up to 1 million juvenile mussels in a given breeding season. They attach with something called a byssal thread, which is like a root or an anchor that they use to attach themselves to solid surfaces, making them extremely difficult to remove. And last but not least, they are filter feeders. And by filter feeding, what they are doing is eating out the plankton, phytoplankton, the basis of our aquatic food chain, which of course impacts our higher species such as our sportfish. So zebra and quagga mussels are native to Eastern Europe. They are native to the Black, Caspian, and Aral Seas, which you may not know are primarily freshwater seas there in Eastern Europe. These species were initially introduced into the Great Lakes region in the 1980s, the late 1980s. After that initial introduction in the late 1980s, they quickly spread over the course of only 2 years into all of the Great Lakes. After only 5 years, they had spread to the majority of our eastern states, including the Mississippi River, as well as the lower Arkansas. 1996, we just start to see more density out there in the east, but probably more significant about this is we start to see these stars over here on the left or the west. Those are dead mussels that are being transported around on recreational boats. 1999, we had the first dead mussel found on a boat here in Colorado. And in 2003, we had the first detection of zebra mussels in one of our adjacent states. That was at El Dorado Lake in the state of Kansas. And I'll show you a couple pictures of that here in just a moment. In 2007, we had the first detection west of the 100th meridian or the Continental Divide at Lake Mead. They're near the city of Las Vegas. This was significant because at the time, the working theory was that the zebra and quagga mussel would never survive in the warm waters in the Southwest. What we have found is the complete opposite. These nice warm waters seem to give them an ideal breeding habitat year-round. So their growth has just been explosive in those waters in the Southwest. I'm going to skip forward about 12 years here, and really what you can see in this almost current distribution is that there is a ton of zebra and quagga mussels to our east, but we are seeing more and more populations out here in the Southwest. This is certainly a growing problem for us, particularly when places such as Lake Powell are completely infested with quagga mussels. People from Colorado love to go visit Lake Powell. Unfortunately, they can easily transport one of these back to our state. So why are zebra and quagga mussels such a big deal? Well, they have significant impacts. Those impacts can be ecological, recreational, economic, and again, they spread extremely quickly. All right, so here's just a couple pictures to show you why this is a problem before I move on to our next species of concern. So this is El Dorado Lake out there in the state of Kansas. In the upper right hand of the screen, you can see on the bottom of just a few of the rocks out there, they were finding just a few mussels. The next picture I'm going to show is about 3 years forward from this when they drew down the reservoir, and that is exactly what they saw out there at El Dorado Lake. Is every single surface was completely covered with these zebra mussels. This, of course, has had devastating impacts on the ecology of the reservoir. Of course, it's not going to be very fun to recreate out there. Imagine water skiing or even trying to go out there and fish from the shoreline. And it has also had devastating impacts to the local economy because there's just a lot less visitation to this water body. So certainly nothing we want to see here in Colorado, but that's kind of the big scary one. But there are other aquatic nuisance species that we are concerned with, ones that are present here in our state at this time. So first, I'm just going to cover a little bit about aquatic invasive plants. These would be plants that live either entirely or mostly submerged in the water and would not be able to survive outside of the water for an extended period of time. So in general, these aquatic invasive plants form what we call a dense monotypic stand, meaning that it's the only plant present in that location and has pushed all of the native species out. That's a problem because the native vegetation serves as a valuable food source for fish, waterfowl, as well as our native insects. This can reduce water quality by reducing water circulation, lowering levels of dissolved oxygen, changes to our temperature as well as pH, and can even slow or stop the spread of water for our agricultural uses. I don't think most of you are out there fishing from boats too routinely, but if you were, I think we could all agree that is not what your boat should look like when you come off the water. It's actually against the law to transport a boat here in Colorado with aquatic vegetation attached. But these dense mats of aquatic weeds can impede all forms of water-based recreation. Again, boating, I think it's really fun to do the 1 foot forward, 2 foot back, trying to get through a dense stand of weeds like this. That can do significant damage to our drive units. Swimming, oh, I see the picture of this poor girl swimming across the lake, and I imagine something like the Loch Ness Monster reaching up and grabbing hold of her and pulling her down into the lake. I know you're all on mute, but I hope no one laughed at my bad joke because it actually is a reality. We actually lose 1 or 2 lives a year here in Colorado from people getting tangled up in this aquatic vegetation and unfortunately losing their lives. Certainly from a fishing perspective, it's pretty challenging to get out there and do your angling in this aquatic vegetation. When I try, I typically don't catch anything but a bunch of weeds, but the fish themselves will also be less healthy because they don't have the native species that they depend upon for food and habitat. So the aquatic invasive plant species that is most prevalent here in Colorado is Eurasian watermilfoil. This species is native to Europe, Asia, and North Africa. It was first officially documented in the 1940s, but was probably here a lot earlier than that. This is a highly invasive plant that can grow up to 1 foot per week, which is insanely fast in the world of plants. As an invasive species, it has the ability to proliferate in a wide variety of ecosystems, including rivers, lakes, streams, ditches, canals, lakes, reservoirs, and ponds. It can grow really long in 2 inches of water. It can grow really tall in 40 feet of water, so it will grow, again, just about anywhere. Eurasian watermilfoil has several different ways that it can be spread. We do sometimes see sexual reproduction through flowering and fruiting. It does do some winter budding, but the primary way that this species spreads around is by fragmentation. And all the fragmentation is when a small piece of this plant breaks off, that has the potential to start up a whole new population. So if you happen to snag into a stand of this milfoil and maybe pull that up on your line and don't take that off and then move to another portion of the river or the lake or the reservoir and cast that back in there, you have the potential to spread this species inadvertently. So here's just a couple pictures of Eurasian watermilfoil out there in the world for your reference. Top left, you can just see a well-developed stand. An identifying characteristic of this plant is it has those 4 leaves arranged around the stem in a whorl of 4 there. Each one of those leaves has 11 to 21 pairs of leaflets. Eurasian watermilfoil also has a very weak vascular system, so when you pick it up out of the water, it will collapse, essentially like you see here on this rock. And then there is just a big old stand of milfoil. I would add that we also have a native milfoil or water milfoil here in Colorado, northern water milfoil. It looks very similar to this species, the difference being the amount of leaflets. Our native milfoil typically has less than 10 leaflets, and it has a much more rigid structure to it. So when you pick it up out of the water, it will retain the structure it would have when it was submerged. So this is the current distribution of Eurasian water milfoil in Colorado. Unfortunately, it is pretty widespread, particularly along the Front Range from Fort Collins all the way down to Pueblo and down to Walsenburg as well. There's not very much of it out on the western slope for now, so just doing everything we can to keep it from spreading. All right, so that was the one plant species I wanted to cover, and now back to our animal species. So again, these are the species of animals that are considered prohibited per our parks and wildlife regulations. So I talked a little bit about the zebra and quagga mussel. Now I'll talk about the other two species that are present here in our state, which are the rusty crayfish and New Zealand mudsnails. So the rusty crayfish is native to the Ohio River Basin, which is a little different than most of the invasive species that we talk about that come in from overseas. This species was first discovered outside of its native range there in the Ohio River Basin back in the 1960s and has had some pretty catastrophic impacts in the locations where it has been introduced. Habitat on this species, as you can guess, is an invasive species. It's pretty adaptable. It survives lakes, rivers, and streams. It can be introduced in a lot of different ways, but some of the primary ways that this species is spread is through the use of illegal bait and also illegal stocking. And what that is somebody moving up from the Ohio River Basin who just loved having those big, tasty crayfish when he was back home. Well, we don't have those here in Colorado. Our crayfish are pretty small and wimpy, so some folks have actually brought these in and introduced them to try to develop them as a food source. So what's the problem with the rusty crayfish? Well, he's a jerk. We have 6 native crayfish species here in the state of Colorado. This one is just much larger and more aggressive than our native crayfish species. It eats small fish, insects, fish eggs, aquatic vegetation. Again, it is a highly aggressive species, so it's not good fish food. I haven't seen this here in Colorado, but I have heard many stories, particularly in the Midwest, where these things have become so prolific that they'll actually attack people when they get out in the water, which kind of sounds like a nightmare in my world. Yeah. Fortunately, they are not very widespread here in Colorado. They are currently only known to 4 locations, and 3 of those 4 are in Routt County up near Steamboat. So that would be Catamount, the Yampa River, and Stagecoach Reservoir. Then we have Sanchez Reservoir, which is down in the bottom of the San Luis Valley. Colorado Parks and Wildlife does have some very specific crayfish regulations in place to try to stop the spread of this species. It is illegal to transport any crayfish live west of the Continental Divide here in our state. All right, last but not least, we have the New Zealand mudsnail. The New Zealand mudsnail was first found here in Colorado in 2004, not too far from Deckers actually. This species is native to New Zealand. It's a small aquatic freshwater snail that was first discovered here in North America in the late 1980s in the Snake River in Idaho and the Madison River up in Montana. Biologically, this is a pretty cool species. Here in the United States, they are all female and reproducing asexually, so girl power in the mudsnail world. They don't like to freeze themselves, but they can easily overwinter in the roots and the mud on the banks of our rivers and lakes that don't actually freeze over winter. As you can see here in the picture with the penny, these things are tiny, about 1/8 inch in length, and can easily be hidden on mud, waders, or gear and moved between locations. Again, they can live just about anywhere. This says they prefer rivers and streams, but we also see them in lakes and reservoirs here in our state. One of the primary ways that these species get moved around is by humans, and particularly those that are recreating in our rivers and along our shorelines. Particularly waders are highly suspect for moving things like New Zealand mudsnails around. They can also be moved around by fish. So the way that that works is the fish comes through, it eats up all these New Zealand mud snails. It feels like it's getting a good meal. The New Zealand mud snail then has a piece of anatomy called a operculum. The operculum is essentially like a garage door that it shuts down on the shell. Once it shuts that down, it's very difficult for the fish to actually digest these snails. So they pass through the digestive tract of the fish unharmed, which can start a whole new population. All right, so this is where New Zealand mud snails are currently known here in our state. There's a heck of a lot of them up there in Boulder, in places like Boulder Creek. The South Platte drainage has a ton of mud snails from 11 miles, Finney, and down all the way through Denver. And then we also have a few populations on the west slope, including the Green River and Dinosaur National Monument, and Uncompahgre and Gunnison Rivers. All right, so moving on a little bit here, I just want to tell you about a few of the things that Colorado Parks and Wildlife is doing to stop the spread of these species here into our states. First and foremost, in order to stop them from spreading, we have to know what's out there. So we have a dedicated team who does nothing except for sample our waterways for invasive species. So we sample about 500 waters here in the state each and every year. Our focus is really on early detection. We want to know as soon as possible if something is in our lakes or reservoirs or rivers, so we have the opportunity to stop it from spreading to locations. We have one of the most aggressive invasive species sampling programs in the nation. The highest risk locations we sample once every 3 weeks throughout the year. And George, is there any way we can mute the background noise? So in addition to our sampling and monitoring program, we also have a very active watercraft.
Robert, I'm going to mute everyone, and then maybe you can unmute yourself and we can see if we can quiet it down a little bit.
That would be great. Thank you, George.
You bet. All right, Robert, why don't you give that a shot?
Mic check, 1, 2.
You're on, I think.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, so we also have our watercraft inspection and decontamination program. One, I guess, saving grace for aquatic invasive species is they can't move themselves from location to location. So we have the opportunity to try to intercept some of these vectors of spread. So Colorado has the largest watercraft inspection and decontamination program in the nation. We have 73 inspection locations here in our state that are operated by a variety of jurisdictions, including Parks and Wildlife, municipalities, counties, the National Park Service, as well as private industry. We have inspection stations from corner to corner, which is intended to give us the highest level of protection, but also make it relatively easy for boaters to comply with our mandatory inspection requirements. Through our inspection and decontamination program, we do intercept a heck of a lot of boats that have invasive species on them. Since the inception of our program back in 2009 through the end of last year, we had intercepted 281 boats coming into our state with confirmed zebra or quagga mussel on them. 2020 has been a banner year for us. Not that that's a great thing, but we have intercepted 94 boats coming into our state with adult mussels on them in the 2020 season. Along that same line, we are also just seeing record uses of our waterways. Our boating numbers are up something like 40% from anything they've ever been in the past. But probably the most important thing that we do is get out there and educate. It's really through education that we gain understanding and support and compliance for our program. I don't think that anybody really wants to purposefully do anything that is detrimental to the longevity and health of our aquatic ecosystems. It's just that they don't know. So any opportunity that we can get to go out and educate folks, we are more than willing to take that on to get this message out as much as possible. To kind of help with that, we have a lot of different user resources. We've tried to cater those to different demographics, such as our anglers, with things like brochures and boot brushes that if we were in person, I would give to every single one of you, and even things for scuba divers and anybody that has come in contact with water. We've tried to cater some outreach materials specific to them. And something pretty cool that we have been doing in 2020 is that through a generous grant from the Bureau of Land Management, we have received some funds to design, build, and deploy wader cleaning stations. The primary purpose behind these wader cleaning stations is really to help stop the continued spread of New Zealand mudsnails. These wader cleaning stations are being deployed at fly shops, private fishing clubs, and are really designed to be used by the guides that are utilizing those shops, their customers, and just anybody that may be coming in. This is a very useful tool, both to clean their gear, but we also hope that it provides an educational platform to make sure people are aware of what they can do to help stop this spread. So we have deployed 7 of those so far in 2020. We just got a second grant to build and deploy quite a few more of these. So if there happen to be any fly shops or people you work out there that you think might be interested in one of these, please let me know and I'd be glad to get one to them. All right, so, Parks and Wildlife's doing everything we can, but we are certainly not alone in this effort. And there are some things that each and every person that is utilizing our waterways can do to help stop this spread. And first and foremost, something that we can all do is just make sure that we are cleaning our gear in between uses. And what does that mean to us? Well, first, just clean. That means thoroughly remove any visible material, including plants, animals, and mud on your footwear and gear with a stiff brush, and then disinfect with one of the 4 following methods that have been shown to kill things such as New Zealand mudsnails, but also our fish pathogens such as whirling disease. So option 1 would be to submerge your gear in a quaternary ammonia-based solution, something like Sparquat or Super HDQ Neutral, for 20 minutes would be effective in killing those. You can soak your gear in 140-degree water for 10 minutes. That's primarily what we do with all of our equipment. You can freeze it overnight, or you can dry it for at least 10 days. That's probably not very practical out there during the summer season when you're trying to go between waters and get out every weekend or week like I do. So some of these first 3 might be a little bit more practical if you're using your equipment on a regular basis. And last but not least, you just want to make sure that you are drying all of your equipment in between each and every use. Again, clean, drain, and dry is really what we're looking for in terms of stopping the spread of these species. Another thing you can do is report. So you awesome folks are out there on these rivers way more than we're ever going to have the opportunity to. If you happen to come across something that you know is an invasive species or just seems out of place, please let us know and we will come out and follow up on those reports as quickly as we possibly can. Certainly some of the Trout Unlimited chapters have reported invasive species to us that have ultimately been confirmed. So we certainly view this as a partnership that we all take part in to protect our waters. So a few different ways you can report. That's our program office phone number. This is our generic email, and our website also has a form where you can report these invasive species. And last but not least, to kind of circle it back there, the #1 tool that we have in the toolbox is education. And I think that all of you can also take an active role in that. Some folks are willing to listen to a biologist from Parks and Wildlife. Some people aren't, and they would much rather look to their peers, their fellow anglers, to provide them with reliable information. If all the anglers out there, if the boaters can stress the importance of stopping the spread of invasive species, then we will all have a much better chance of protecting our favorite waters from these invasions, so we can continue to have those awesome fisheries that we are blessed with here in Colorado. So I'll just kind of leave this comic up there for a little bit of thought, and thanks again for the opportunity. If anybody has any questions or comments, I would be glad to take those at this time.
All right, so I've unmuted everyone. And so if you're still muted, you can unmute yourself. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask Robert?
Robert, this is Uli. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, loud and clear.
Very good. I would suggest one thing is a good talk, but I'm a heavy user of 11-mile spinney and antero. And I catch 20-pound northern pike in 11-mile antero, excuse me, spinney regularly, 10-pound trout occasionally. But the thing that has really disturbed me, 11-mile and antero, because you can use bait there. There are a lot of what I call slob fishermen. They leave their trash behind. Whenever I go with my grandkids, first thing we do, we pick up all the trash, and anybody that's standing around with their beer cans on the ground or paper, I always tell them, I said, you know, you take care of Mother Nature, she'll take care of you. And this is our water supply. I realize it's a different type of invasive species, but it has always amazed me how hopefully there are people from out of state. Can't believe Coloradans would do that, because sometimes it really gets bad. But you may want to interject just as a footnote that you know, trash pickup is really important. The thing that is so amazing to me up in Antero, I occasionally will kill a fish if it's badly hooked and bleeding. But many times they're absolutely chock full of snails, which, and the snail flesh has been digested, the shells are empty. But they really are eaters of snails, which kind of surprised me. I mean, if I killed a 7-pound cutbow, and that critter had about 100 snails in the belly. Wow. Snail shells.
Yeah, so a couple things there. Well, you know, that's a really good point about our ethics when we're out there utilizing those resources. You know, we try to preach that as much as we can, the leave no trace kind of ethics that we should all be following when we're out there. And I do the same thing as you when I get out with my kid. We pick up all the trash before we even start, and we make sure to do the same when we leave. But I can certainly make sure we cover that a little bit in these presentations. And then in regards to the snails, we do not know of any New Zealand mud snails there at Antero. There are several native snail species like the Physa and Limnea that I know the fish there are feeding upon, which don't necessarily have that operculum that the New Zealand mud snail has to protect itself from digestion. I've certainly seen that in the fish I've caught there as well.
There's actually a number of fly patterns that imitate snail. They are recognized as a trout food.
Yep.
Well, they probably work pretty good.
Robert, this is George.
Yeah.
There was
Oh, sorry,
a question.
George. Yeah, go ahead.
There was a question that came over the chat. Yes, did you see that?
I do see that.
Ah.
Yes, so invasive fish. Yes, so invasive fish are, such as the Asian carp, are certainly of concern. They are not known here in Colorado at this time, which is an excellent thing. They're actually not covered in our A.N.S regulations because they are covered in our fish health regulations, so I don't usually talk about them. But the Asian carp, I would say, is a huge concern to us. It is not too far from our eastern border in the state of Kansas. And we talked a little bit about bait there, or Uli did, and it does concern me greatly that somebody could be bringing in one of those juvenile big head carp as bait and inadvertently introducing it to our state. And that would be absolutely devastating. So we do participate in many of the regional committees focused on Asian carp, and we really do what we can to make sure they don't get in here in the first place, because it would be a huge problem.
And what about giant snakehead?
Same thing. Yep, it's not as hot of a topic because it's not as close to us or spreading quite as aggressively as the Asian carp are. But yep, same kind of story. We're just doing what we can to keep them out of here, which I think we can all agree is for the best.
They're actually good eating.
They are, and I bet you they're pretty fun to catch too. But it's the impacts outside of that that we don't want to see. Yeah.
I tried them in Thailand.
Oh, okay.
They're
Pretty
more
good.
of a warm water fish, I think, aren't they?
Yes. Yep. Which they still could potentially thrive in our eastern plains reservoirs that tend to support those warm water fisheries pretty.
You know, I did have, this is Uli again, one more question.
Yes, sir.
I like to fish in Alaska, mainly for silvers. And up there, they encourage you to gut the fish and leave the innards in the creek to the river to help with the nutrient load for the fry. But in Colorado, I was told by a game warden that if you got a fish by a lake and leave the innards in the lake or river, I'll give you a ticket for littering. And I'm just wondering, why do we not encourage folks that want to kill a fish to leave the innards in the system for the nutrient base in Colorado?
I'm going to be honest with you, Uli, and tell you that I don't know the answer to that question, but I will certainly get it for you and pass that over to you via George or one of the other folks in the
Yeah,
chat.
it could be in Colorado, I would guess, just like Antero. The reason it's such a tremendously prolific fishery. I mean, the fish in there grow an inch and a half a month in the summertime. You got cattle upstream, and a cow makes the equivalent of 10 pounds of nutrients, excuse me, 10 people equivalents of nutrients every day. So all that nutrient gets flushed into the lake. It's shallow, and there's a tremendous weed growth in the summertime, which is great for the scuds and other critters that the trout eat. But that may be the answer. They just don't want that additional nutrient load in our waterways. But also, obviously, it would be pretty ugly to have a bunch of innards floating around the lake.
Yes, it would. I honestly, again, don't know, Uli, but I will find the answer for you and get that over to you, okay?
Yeah, Robert, why don't you just email it to me? And Yuli, I'm not sure if I still have your email from when we fished the green together, so why don't you email me at georgefr@aol.com. And when I get the note from Robert, I will forward it to you. How's
Thank
that?
you.
Yes, again, that's georgefr@aol.com.
Excellent. I will definitely do that.
Thank you, Robert.
Of course. Well, thank you again for the opportunity. I appreciate you listening to me. And if any questions or anything come up, just let me know.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you. Takes all of us.
It was nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Robert.
My
Buzz,
pleasure.
I apologize for stopping your screen share. Alan, do you have a word to say, or Brian, would you like to move on with the program?
Sure. We're lucky enough to have Phil Tereyla with us tonight. We'll welcome him in a couple seconds here, but he came to Colorado a number of years ago in 4th grade and started fly fishing around when he turned 11. And he's been a guide on the South Platte for 14, 15 years now. He's really well known for a lot of things, but the thing I always know about Phil is that he can see fish that I can't see. And so what he's going to talk about tonight is targeting trophy browns and seeing fish that I can't see. And let's welcome Phil to the program. Take it away, Phil.
Hey guys, well, yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I don't know if Robert's still around, but that was awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all that info. That was super great stuff. So, yeah, let me go ahead and get the screen share going here, and we'll get going.
And Philip, I'm going to give a shot muting everybody. And so let me know if you have trouble unmuting yourself.
Okay, we got everything all up there. Everyone can hear me?
Okay, everybody's muted. So Phil, have you unmuted yourself?
Yes, sir. There we go.
There we go. We can hear you great now, and
All
we
right.
can see your presentation. Go right ahead.
All right, awesome. Well, yeah, thank you so much again for having me, guys. Like Brian said, my stepdad got stationed in Peterson Air Force Base when I was in third grade. We moved out here after that summer, so been tormenting trout, I guess, on the South Platte and surrounding waters since then. Currently guide for the Angler's Covey Fly Shop here in Colorado Springs, and also the Broadmoor Hotel. But yeah, I love nothing more than teaching and kind of sharing at least what I consider my knowledge. Anyways, there's 100 different ways to do all this, but hopefully this will help you out as we're moving into our fall season. I know it doesn't seem like fall, it's been so warm, but hopefully coming forward here with some of these cooler temps, it'll be a little bit more like fall. So yeah, so more than anything, we're going to be talking about targeting trophy fall trout this evening. Primarily, a lot of browns. That's kind of the name of the game in the fall for what most people are looking for. Don't sell the rainbow short as well. I know out on the Dream right now, there's some very large rainbows mulling around as well. So, those guys are every bit as strong and as gorgeous as those big brownies. But here's a couple of big browns from recent trips in the fall. The one on the left, or as you're looking at the screen, our left, that's in upstate New York on one of the tribs, Lake Ontario tributaries. And then a good client of mine, Michael, there on the right with a beautiful brownie from the Dream Stream as well. Very early fall, that fish. I believe that fish was the second or third week of September a few years back. So yeah, so tonight, discussion topics for our success in the fall. We'll go over why fall is such a great time of year to target these large fish. We'll go over the difference kind of between migratory fish and then your resident fish, and kind of how to target each one of those. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up spawning beds during this time of year. It's definitely kind of a hot topic for a lot of us, and just encouraging our rivers to stay as great as they are, and trying to, I won't get on a soapbox on or try to force my ethics on anybody, but just kind of what to look for, if nothing else, just to watch where you're walking. Locating large trout during the fall, where those bigger fish are going to be trying to sit, where you'll be able to find them. Focusing on the food sources. What are those big fish eating, and what they are looking for in order to, maintain their large size, especially in the fall with the brown spawning. How are they going to get those high caloric needs in order to undergo that kind of rigorous spawning ritual? I know a lot of times people are doing a lot of nymphing during the fall, looking for those big browns. Don't sell dry flies short. We'll talk a little bit about getting those big fish to come up and eat on the surface. A lot of people are, the streamers are really growing. I think the new thing, the tug is the drug or something like that. So we'll talk a little bit about getting fish to eat streamers. And then finally, the nymph game as well, and what we're kind of focusing on there. So yeah, so why fall? Typically your fall months, I start a little bit earlier in the late summer, August into November, and you could probably even stretch that into early December, depending on water temps and kind of our weather, right? So late August, I'll find kokanee salmon running on the Dream. Quite frankly, as early as the end of July is the earliest that I've caught them. But kind of towards the end or towards the middle of August, we really start to see those cooler night temperatures. That will spur some fish to start moving around. I know that the days are still long, but as you're getting into those cooler August nights and into September, that's going to lower our water temperatures and really start to get those fish, encouraging them to move. October, especially in Colorado, October is a big spawning month on the South Platte River. So a lot of those fish will be undergoing their annual spawn every October. You could almost move that back a month in November if you moved a little bit further north. The North Platte River up in Wyoming, we'll start to see those fish, especially up on like the Miracle Mile, a section of the North Platte. They'll start to move, end of October into the first week or so of November. And then there'll be a lot of fish in the system up there throughout November and into December. We're going to focus a lot on those pre and post spawn fish. Pre-spawn fish, they understand what is ahead of them as far as their spawning ritual. It takes a lot for them, for the males especially, they're going to be kind of dueling off other males, establishing dominance, and really just trying to make sure that their bloodline continues. The females as well, digging their spawning beds. It's a really rigorous and tough ritual that they undergo every year. So those pre-spawn fish, they're going to be looking for a lot of high calorie meals in order to kind of bulk up so that they're not, or so that they're able to undergo all that. It's kind of like carb loading, before a big game or something like that athletes will do. And then same thing, the post-spawn fish. Those fish are done and they've shed all those calories, and they're, the females, if you catch a female post-spawn, a lot of times she's going to be long and skinny. They're going to be looking to put that feed bag back on in order to try to re-up their calories and get their body mass back. Kind of like I touched about, August, September, those shorter days and those cooler water temps, that's going to spur a lot of those fish to move. And then again, just the spawning themselves. I mean, while they're, I'm not going to target or encourage anybody to target fish on spawning beds. I try to educate all my clients by pointing them out, showing people what those fish look like when they're in, a foot or two of fast water and on their clear spawning bed. But those fish, while they're not on their beds, they're still going to be looking for those calories while they're not engaged in their spawn. So, all right. So here are two very different pictures. The one on the left, the young man in the red hat, a good buddy of mine, that is a post-spawn fish. You can see she's a little bit longer, a little bit skinnier. That's towards the end of November into December up on the North Platte River. So she's undergone all of her, spawning, and she's starting to really put that feed bag back on. Meanwhile, the one on the right was a client of mine. We found that fish the first week of September, just starting to move up into the dream. You can see she's big, fat. She's fresh out of the lake, but she's on her way to go, give us more of those little baby brownies on the dream. So just an awesome kind of contrast to what those fish can look like pre and post spawn. Now, when we talk about migratory trout, for myself, chasing migratory trout has become a pretty big passion, whether it's out on the Dream Stream or going up to Wyoming, chasing those fish that move out of the Great Lakes, chasing steelhead that move out of the ocean into the Pacific Northwest. Finding those fish that live in a larger body of water and move into a smaller body of water really intrigues me. They're doing so really for the only purpose to spawn, which, to be honest, that's why we've had such a tough year or tough fall on the Dream Stream this year, and why there's not high numbers of large fish out there this year. They're doing work on the dam in 11 Mile Canyon. So a lot of they've had the flows quite minimal, starting that beginning of September. So those fish just haven't had any reason or, any feeling of safety really to move out of a big body of water into a smaller body of water. The best way I can describe it is, I think 11 Mile Reservoir at its deepest is somewhere around 110 feet deep when it's full. So, if you're a 10-pound trout, would you want to leave the safety of a 110-foot reservoir to go into a river at its deepest spot, 2.5, 3 feet deep? I personally wouldn't if I'm that fish. The only thing that would encourage those fish to move is in order to spawn. Now, not only do fish move out of lakes into rivers, but they'll also move out of the larger rivers into some of the smaller tributaries. I know Colorado Parks and Wildlife has done a great job closing down some of the small tributaries that flow into the Colorado River on the western slope, as some of those large brown trout will migrate up those very small creeks, you know, about as wide as a lane of traffic in order to spawn. But again, that's why those fish are moving. They're not moving into 4 or 6 inches of water in order just to be there. They're moving there strictly because they want to spawn. Other things that'll trigger migration are significant changes in water level. I call it the hidden migration on the Dream Stream, and that's a result to runoff. When we get that runoff period during June, where we have all that high oxygenated, very cold water, pushing all that cold water and food into 11-mile reservoir, that will encourage those fish to move up into the river system. So while the Dream Stream is well known, especially in the spring and fall, for its migratory runs, I call it the hidden migration, because not a ton of people think about that movement just because of high water. And we'll see in June and early July, we'll see some of our biggest summer fish out there that showed up during June when the water was high and they felt safe enough to move. Other big changes, just along with the seasons, significant changes in weather. As the temperatures start to drop and the water temperatures kind of drop down into the 50s, you'll start to see those fish move a bit more. You know, it's not going to be, you know, we get a flash flood event or something like that, that might not be the most conducive, because it's just going to have a lot of silt and sediment. But, you know, any type of cooling trend or anything where that water temperature is going to come down a little bit is really going to encourage those fish to move. Likewise, you know, in the fall or in the spring, when those fish are migrating out of the river or out of the lake, any type of overcast skies is going to encourage those fish to move, kind of undercover, right? If it's a bluebird day and those fish are still migrating, especially in the spring when it's low water, typically anyways, coming out of winter, our winter flows, those cloudy days are going to be where those fish feel most safe and in order to move and migrate. The other thing as well, they will follow other species. You know, we have kokanee salmon out there on the Dream, you know, and other rivers as well, the Gunnison, those large browns and the rainbows as well. They'll kind of view it as almost a party. They'll follow all those kokanee running upstream, be like, well, you know, what's going on? Let's see what's going on with this little fish party. And they'll follow up, and they're kind of met with, you know, all these little kokanee salmon eggs dropping down, easy morsels of protein in order for them to, again, encourage them to eat and gain all those caloric needs. So here, real quick, I just wanted to put up a couple pictures of spawning beds. Now, it's going to look very different depending a lot of times on what river you're on. The picture looking at the screen on your left, that's actually a very large spawning bed at Deckers. You know, just because of the makeup of the river bottom, at Deckers, it's going to be, you know, they're going to be those very clear gravel, kind of oval shaped depressions, usually shallow riffles, plenty of oxygen. But what happens is, the reason they look like a little bowl in that egg shape is the female will fan her bed and clear all the sediment off of those rocks, creating that depression so that when she drops her eggs, they have kind of a backstop to land in. The one on the right there, that's up on the North Platte River in Wyoming. That whole riffle you can see is almost a giant spawning bed. Just fish spawning and moving around everywhere. So if nothing else, again, I always advise my clients not to cast at those fish. Those fish are doing what they want to do in order to provide us a future for those fisheries. You know, ripping them off their beds can have negative effects to their mortality, and we don't want that. But if nothing else, that's what we want to look for while we're walking in the rivers, making sure we're not stepping on any of those, crushing any of those little eggs, just making sure that, again, we're kind of being advocates for the future of our fisheries. All right, so locating trophy fall trout. Now fish will begin to retreat to the deeper riffles and runs. So those large fish, again, you want to always, especially when we're talking about migratory fish, you want to always imagine where those fish are going to feel safest, right? So, any deep water where you can't see the bottom of the river is a great place to probe. Those fish will feel much safer there than they would in a very fast or shallow riffle. Any type of deeper riffle, 2 to 4 feet, where those fish can feel safe in the water depth, but also with the disruption of the surface of the water. Great locations for those fish to hide and at least feel safe. The deep water below those spawning beds. So like that last photo there with all those spawning beds up on the North Platte. Below that, there's a very, very big deep run where those fish can kind of move to when they're done engaging and actively spawning and actually get their feed going. So probing those deep areas below spawning beds rather than targeting the fish on spawning beds is a great way to target actively feeding fish. And then structure. Structure is a big thing, especially for brown trout. I truly believe browns are kind of like the largemouth bass of the trout world. They very much are ambush predators, and they really do want to feel safe. The best example I can give of that, last fall on the Arkansas River tailwater, my buddy and I were down there. The flows were, I think, 130, 150-ish. Water clarity was only about a foot. And while we were kind of having our way with a lot of beautiful rainbows just in the riffles and runs and where you might have them, any of those rock diamonds, we kind of started tight line nymphing in and around those rocks. We were fortunate enough to find a couple of large browns kind of in their pre-spawn mode that ended up going 26 and 28 inches. Now those fish, even in the poor water clarity, the higher flows, they were not out in those typical feeding lanes. They were tucked up tight to structure. So, regardless of how safe they may have felt just because of the water, they were still very structure oriented. So targeting large rock piles, undercut banks, logs, really any structure where those fish can get out of the way and feel a little bit safer is a great place to target. So here's a great example. This is the Middle Fork, or this is just above Spinney Reservoir on the South Platte. This is a great little spot. I'm sure if any of you have kind of ventured out there, it's a pretty well-known little spot, but just upstream of that bridge there is a big deep run, and it kind of swirls around and has some other deep water right below. Those weirs and those trestles are just awesome spots for those trout, especially large browns, to hide and feel safe. Whether they are up at the top of the run or at the bottom of the run, wherever they may be as well, if you find them feeding, the reason they're going to be there is because they can retreat to that structure and feel safe afterwards. So focusing on that structure is a big key for me, especially when targeting the large browns. Now talking food sources for our trophy trout. When we start talking about this, I really do like to discuss your migratory versus your resident fish. Now, all of these large fish will be looking for some larger food sources, leeches, cranes, scuds, your egg patterns, worms, sow bugs, those crayfish, small suckers, smaller trout, pretty much anything that can give them a high amount of calories in one bite. Now, those food sources, while resident fish will certainly also look and target those food sources, those migratory fish are really going to key in on some of the larger foods. Again, when I start to talk about those large migratory browns, or even the rainbows in the spring, or those large fish that will move up with them in the fall, I'm not so much matching the hatch. If I walk up on a big brown in the fall, I'm not matching the hatch typically at hand. There may be midges or blue-winged olives coming off during the fall, but my thought process is, what are those fish feeding on in the lake, right? If they're in the river system for 1 month out of the year, they probably aren't going to adapt and be focused as much on those midges or blue-winged olives as they would what they feed on in the reservoir. Okay, so what are they eating in the reservoir? They're focusing on those crayfish, those small suckers, smaller trout, scuds, anything a little bit on that larger side. So now, vice versa, you have the resident fish, those fish that live in the river system year round. Those fish will be a little bit more hatch oriented. So focusing on your blue-winged olives, your midges, your October caddis, that's where you're going to find a little bit more success with your large resident fish. So kind of just making sure that as you're picking your flies, you kind of understand what you are feeding those fish. For me, I always like to have one of those larger food sources on, whether it be a leech or a crane fly larva, you know, a scud. And obviously eggs in the current, eggs, if fish are spawning, eggs are going to be prevalent in the water as well. So having those big eggy morsels, you know, lots of protein, is a great way to fool those fish. But I like to lead my nymph rig with one of those larger patterns. If I'm using a double nymph rig, I will probably meet halfway in the middle between, you know, that fall hatch and something similar that those fish may be more accustomed to in the lake. You know, the main hatch during the summer is going to be that calabatus. So, you know, finding a bug that kind of mimics, you know, maybe rather than a size 14 or 16 calabatus, or, you know, the size 20 blue-winged olive that's hatching on the river, you know, maybe focusing on like a 16 or an 18 mayfly pattern is a great way to kind of cross over. If you're going to throw a triple nymph rig, which is really popular now, you know, that third one can be a very hatch specific pattern as well. So, you know, your juju blue-winged olives and little tiny pheasant tails, Darth Beta, stuff like that. So that would be kind of my recommendation, at least on targeting and focusing on the food source that you're feeding those fish. So again, two very different fish here. The one on the left, again, upstate New York, those fish really were focused on leeches. Meanwhile, the one on the right, a great client of mine, Mike Martinez, he, you know, we were sight fishing to this fish, and that fish ended up eating a size 18 pheasant tail. So kind of, again, we crossed over, kind of mimicked what those fish were feeding on, both in the reservoir, but maybe, you know, something that they might start to focus on in the river. So fall dries. Now, especially during the early fall, when those fish will begin to start moving out of the lakes and into the river systems, you know, they are going to focus a lot on those undercut banks and any type of structure. You know, I'm thinking mostly here, like on the Middle Fork and above Spinney Mountain Reservoir. It's typically very low, late summer, early fall. So those fish that move are going to want to find places to hide. Now, when you're targeting those spots, especially undercut banks, hoppers and terrestrials are a great way to get those fish to come up and eat. You know, you can certainly find those fish eating hoppers all the way through September and even into early October, depending on our weather and how warm or cold it is. So don't sell yourself short as you get into fall, throwing those dries. Again, you know, a big size 8 hopper is a great high calorie meal for those big fish. Some of my favorite patterns as well, the Charlie Boy hopper, Fat Alberts, chubby Chernobyls have become a great bug as well here in the past couple years. An Amy's ant in a red or that green color are awesome. And especially those foam ones too, because you can drop, you know, a beadhead nymph off of them as well, and you kind of give those fish two different targets on the surface and also below. So fall streamers, you know, a lot of people, like I said earlier, they're really moving towards the streamer game, trying to focus and find those most aggressive fish. In a lot of our river systems, whether it be the Dream Stream or the Arkansas or even the South Platte at Deckers, I don't know if anyone was there in the last few weeks, and along with some of those great fish, there's also a great number of little tiny ones rolling around. But there's an increased number of smaller trout moving around in the river. So those juveniles create a food source. Those fish have not yet quite learned where is safe and where isn't. So they're just kind of out there, reckless abandon, easy meals for those large predatory fish. It's a great pre-spawn food source. Again, you know, would you rather, if you're a big brown trout getting ready to spawn, would you rather eat 2 million midges or, you know, 10 little baby trout? That's probably one thing that those fish are thinking about. And if the chance presents itself that a small fish comes into its lair, it's probably going to eat it. Kind of again, as you move into closer towards spawning times, those fish become very territorial. The males especially, they want their bloodline to continue. You know, they want to establish dominance. So they're going to bend off really any fish or any intruder that comes into their personal space. Focusing on your deep runs and structure, again, any logs, any of those large rock piles, anywhere where those fish can hide, you know, is a great spot for them to ambush prey. You know, if a little trout kind of strays from the side of the river and ends up under a rock, it's an easy meal for that fish to kind of ambush. So some of my favorite patterns, again, they're listed there. Sparkle minnows, autumn splendors, sculpzillas, sex dungeons, and other large double jointed and articulated patterns. Anything with a lot of movement and anything that can really kind of elicit a violent strike from a predatory or ambush predator. So that's one of my favorite fish. Again, upstate New York on that one. Those fish in the Great Lakes there, they love to eat, you know, big food. While they're in the lake, they're focused primarily on alewives, which I was fortunate enough to see how big an alewife is in person. That they also will eat a lot of crayfish, and there's plenty of crayfish in those little tributaries flowing into the Great Lakes. But I have to tell you the story of so Landon and I, we were up in Wisconsin, and we were looking for some fish, and we had just kind of finished up for the day and went ahead and went over to this pier, and there were big spotlights on the side of the pier, and we looked down, and there were fish just destroying shrimp, and those fish ended up to being 10 to 14 inches long, and those are the alewives that those Great Lakes brown trout will feed on, which is why they grow to 15 to 30 pounds. So, you know, those fish focusing on those big food sources, whether it be crayfish or, you know, large fish that they feed on in the lake, is just another example of really kind of matching your hatch to what those fish feed on in the lake. So finally, kind of fall nymphing. While a lot of people will absolutely, you know, do nothing but throw streamers and try to elicit those predatory strikes, for my money, I think I've caught more large browns and large rainbows while nymphing. You know, for those big fish, it's just an awesome way for them to continue to feed while conserving energy. You know, those big fish have reached those sizes. You know, it's kind of an old saying, those fish don't get big by being dumb. You know, and this is the case. They not only are they not dumb in deciding what they want to eat, but also how they eat. So conserving energy and focusing on what they can do, you know, put in as minimal effort as they can and still maintain their caloric needs. So while you're nymphing in the fall, I really like to focus on the riffles and runs below spawning beds. You know, using those worms and egg patterns, cranefly larvae, stones, depending on your river. But those runs below the spawning beds, you know, those fish may be doing their thing up in the riffles spawning, but you will definitely be able to find those fish that are actively feeding and just kind of trying to re-up their batteries as they're in that run. The deep runs and pools, like I said before, that you can't see to the bottom of. You know, this is where sight fishing kind of goes out the window a lot of times, especially if the flows are up. If you can't see the bottom, that is a great place to target trophy trout. If you can't see them, they have a much more difficult time seeing you. But they're down there, and, you know, getting your flies down to the bottom and seeing what's down in those deep runs, you know, it kind of is one of those things where you'll just look at a run and go, boy, it looks like there'd be a fish at the bottom of that run. Well, there probably is, and it probably is a large fish, especially during the fall months. Once again, I can't stress it enough, that structure, okay? Focusing your efforts in structure, especially if you're looking for large brown trout. Rock piles, weirs, undercuts, logs, truly anything that can give those fish an opportunity to escape and feel hidden is a great place. Whether you're nymphing around those rocks, whether you're swinging a streamer around those rocks, it doesn't matter. Those fish love structure, and it's the perfect spot for them to hide. Now, when I'm talking point flies during the fall, again, you know, the eggs, because fish are spawning and there's eggs in the water. As those fish are digging their beds, they're kicking up worms and leeches and other things on the river bottom. So using that as a point fly, again, not only to mimic some of those larger food sources and high calorie items that those fish really enjoy, but those are my go-to point flies on a tandem rig. When you're talking your trailers, you know, copper johns, 2-bit hookers, your soft tackle pheasant tails, you know, sizes 16, especially on our rivers here, the Dream, some of those other ones, you know, the Williams Fork, stuff like that, the fish are migrating. You know, size 16 to 18 is a great way to start. But definitely match your trailing nymphs to the size and to the size of the most prevalent hatch at hand. You know, if you're going to use 2, you know, you may go with a leech or a worm up front with a bar emerger or a pheasant tail below. If you're going to use 3, you know, you could size up that middle bug, like I said, to a 16 or an 18 and have a 20 or 22 down below. So that's really kind of...
Hey, pardon me, Phil, this is George.
Sure.
We've got a chat question.
Oh.
This is from Chris. He says, loves the presentation. And can you talk a little bit about tippets and leaders, I assume, for the fall nymphing?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So as far as, you know, your leaders and tippets, as far as that, while you're nymphing, typically I'm using a 9-foot fluorocarbon leader. When it comes to the fall, and especially my guide trips on the Dreamstream, you know, I really want to give my clients the best opportunity that they can get. So using 9-foot fluorocarbon leaders, whether it's 4X, 5X, or 6X, will for me largely depend on the water flow and clarity. Basically, since the beginning of September on the Dream right now, I've been using a 6X fluorocarbon leader with 6X tippet and size 20 and 22 flies. It's just been very, very low, very clear. The high pressure as well has kind of kept those fish very smart, those ones that are in the system, very smart. So give yourself the best opportunity. I don't know if some people believe that fluorocarbon doesn't make a difference. I don't know. For me, it does. I don't know if it's a confidence thing, but for me, I think I see a difference in the number of fish that you can get to eat using fluorocarbon. Now, for me, my typical rule of thumb, kind of at least on the Dreamstream, is, you know, I'd say from 70 CFS to 125, or maybe even as low as 100 CFS. I will typically use 5X. If the water isn't gin clear, you can get away with 4X. Over 100 or 125 CFS, I'm typically using 4X, at least here on the Dream. Now, when I go up to the North Platte River in Wyoming, I am using a mono leader. I do use fluorocarbon tippet still, but I'm typically running 3X leaders with either 3 or 4X tippet up there. It's just larger water. You know, their winter flows up there are 500 CFS plus typically. So, you know, bigger rivers like that, those big fish, you're going to want a little bit of that extra strength. And they don't seem to mind on those bigger rivers. But if you're, you know, sight fishing on the Dream right now, you're going to want that light line. And like I said, I personally prefer fluorocarbon right now. So I hope that answered the question.
I think so. Thank you.
All right. There, I'm going to just close that chat out. Oh, shoot. There it goes. So yeah, there's another big, beautiful buck with, believe it or not, a size 10 stonefly right in its face. Again, that was caught in a deep run directly below a big stretch of spawning beds. You know, as I mentioned, when those fish are up actively spawning, those females turning on their sides, fanning their beds, as they're clearing that gravel, they're removing bugs and other sediment out of their bed. So there's going to be, like I mentioned, worms, stones, smaller flies as well, leeches. They're kind of almost chumming the water for you below the spawning beds. So focusing on that deep water below beds with some of those bigger food sources is a great way to target those big trophy browns. All right. So closing thoughts there, guys. Fall definitely offers a chance to catch some truly trophy trout, whether it be browns or rainbows. Now, while most of those pictures or all of them were of brown trout, focusing on your same techniques during the spring months with the rainbows is a great way to find success there. I know that's really just around the corner. You know, hopefully 2020 closes out here pretty quick and we can get on to 2021. You know, just like those big browns that are going to be hanging in structure and deep runs and feeding on those big food sources below spawning beds, you know, it's a great way to find those large rainbows that have moved up as well. So I really think, you know, browns and bows, but, you know, in general, just focusing on your larger trout, great strategies there. Again, I tend to ask people to leave fish on their spawning beds alone. You know, they are kind of the future of our fisheries. They're there giving us our little baby trout for the future. Yeah, just it's a great thing to watch, but definitely try to just let them do their thing uninterrupted. I hope also you guys can take away that, you know, you can catch these large fish on any discipline, whether it be dries, nymphs, or streamers. These big fish, you know, when they first move up out of the lake, or as they kind of move up early fall, late summer, they're definitely susceptible to coming up and eating a hopper. Nymphing, again, will always be a very productive means just because those large fish are going to want to conserve their energy, and streamers are going to bring out their most predatory nature. So finding those fish on any of the three disciplines is a great way, whichever your favorite, to do. And then, yeah, I think finally my final point would just be feed them the good stuff, you know, and in my opinion, feeding them the good stuff is giving them those flies that you're confident in. For me, it's hard to go wrong with a leech followed by, you know, a big soft tackle pheasant tail, and then maybe you know, a little red copper john behind it. This time of year, that's kind of what I'm throwing right now, looking for those bigger fish. So yeah, I think that's about it, guys. Does anyone be more than happy to answer any questions? So
I do have a question. This is Cindy. So on a year like this where we've had no rain and we're in total 100% drought and fires,
Mm-hmm.
it seems like every place we go, the water is super duper duper low.
Yeah.
Any fish that we find, we're lucky if it's 5 inches long. So it's the opposite of the trophy trout. I mean, we're getting fling fish and we're taking out the tenkara rods, and flinging them out of the water. Can you comment on strategies when the water ends up being super low to find the bigger fish, because they are not in those waters unless they're under the banks that you can't get to?
Right. No, and that's been our issue a lot of this year, finding those fish. They're not going to be on your typical shelves where the water goes from fast to deep really quick like they are a lot of times this time of year. They are, especially in low water. That's when it is time to really focus on structure. What was it? I think it was last Thursday. I was down around Nighthawk in Decker's area, and I didn't even think smaller fish knew how to do this yet, but I saw about a 12-inch brown trout, and it was glued underneath a rock. I mean, I saw its little tail just sticking out right behind it, but that fish was just stuck right underneath the rock, hoping, stay away from predators. So yeah, especially this time of year, if you're looking for some of those bigger fish, focusing on really the structure, and then that deep water that you just can't see the bottom of, and getting down there. I've been doing a fair number of guide trips down on the Arkansas River down in Pueblo lately as well. You're weeding through a lot of those little fish to find the larger ones. But putting that work in, and still focusing, believing in that strategy of focusing on that deeper water that you can't see the bottom, focusing on that structure, that tends to bring the most success for me, especially in low water conditions. You're really not going to see them. It's going to be that water that you can't see them that you need to focus on.
Phil, we got a question on the chat about one of your favorite flies. Pardon me.
Yeah, absolutely. So
wondering about crane flies in particular. What patterns of crane flies do you like?
The crane pane there. I really do like John Barr's crane fly larva. That's an awesome pattern. And also you have to add very little weight if you're using that one. Schaefer's gummy crane is another one I've kind of picked up a little bit of traction on the last, 6 months or so. I've been using a lot more of those Schaefer's gummy cranes. I really like those. But I'd say those two are probably my two favorites that you could buy in a shop that aren't my terrible looking crane fly larva. It looks like a pickle. So
thank you, Phil.
yes, sir.
Well, great. I don't know, George, am I live?
You are live, Alan. You just go right ahead.
So Phil and Rob, thanks so much. Been a great presentation. We had a lot of folks joining the Zoom. Does anyone have any additional questions or comments? It's been a great presentation. Thanks again, both you guys.
I wanted to make another comment. I sent it out to George, again, this is Cindy, that the Forest Service is shutting down the Arapahoe and Roosevelt National Forest areas in Clear Creek, Jefferson, Gilpin, Boulder, and Larimer counties. So no access in there. So if you're planning on, fishing some of the smaller rivers and creeks in the Front Range, they're shutting them down until further notice because of the fires.
That takes effect tomorrow at midnight.
Yeah.
I just saw that. I'm glad you brought that up. Wow.
So for those of us who are trying to fish a little closer to home lately, which we've been doing, we've been up on Boulder Creek and the St. Vrain and Clear Creek in that area. A lot of that's going to be off limits now.
Yep.
So what, Cindy, you and Steve are like what, in different houses or?